is this technology even remotely possible? Because one of the things you must have done when you heard these claims and you heard that they were watering it down, you must have contacted the people who make those machines. You must have contacted other industry experts. And there was this brewing like it's not possible that Theranos can do what they do. Will it ever be possible to prick your finger? Is that like something that the other competitors are working on or are close to? Or is this so fantastical that you're laughed out of the room even?
There have been a lot of researchers for the past 20 years in academia and industry who have been trying to crack that nut, namely running a bunch of tests on just a tiny sample of blood.
And the benefit of doing that versus pulling blood is what?
Well, I mean, it is easier. There are a lot of people. I mean, if you listen to Elizabeth Holmes, certainly she had a phobia of needles that she inherited from her mother. And if you heard her at the height of her fame in her various interviews, she likened, getting a blood draw with the hypodermic needle to a medieval torture mechanism.
Which is ridiculous.
I don't know that everyone feels that way. But
I thought that was one of the most ridiculous. When I heard the reason for this test,
right,
I was like, well, that's cool that you can do it with the prick of blood, but and I guess you could do it more frequently, which would also be cool.
Right, you could do it more.
But if I've got cancer or potentially, or I'm sick, like not a big imposition to take a couple of vials of blood.
Well, actually,
is it? I don't know. It just rang to me like
there are certain segments of the population for whom it would be really useful. Newborns, to be able to take a tiny little drop from them.
Okay, that's legit. I've seen my newborn get blood drawn. It's pretty brutal to watch.
Cancer patients, one of the...
Because they're weak?
Yeah, one of the characters in the book was a Safeway executive, and Safeway, and along with Walgreens, was one of Theranos' two retail partners. They were lucky that their partnership with Theranos fell apart before Theranos ever went live with its tests in Safeway stores. But in the course of reporting the book, I spoke to this woman who was a high-ranking executive at Safeway and who came to have suspicions about the accuracy of the Theranos technology, but she had initially been really taken with the potential of this technology because when she had first met Elizabeth Holmes, her husband had cancer, and he was getting stuck with needles repeatedly in order to analyze his blood so that they knew how to change his drug regimen. And she thought that the finger stick technology would have been a godsend.
But with this Edison technology, so people have been working on it for decades. They've come up with nothing, basically.
Right.
And so maybe in another 20, 30 years, it might be possible?
Well,
what I've always wondered about Elizabeth. Is she so deranged that she never saw that this wasn't possible? Or is she so deranged that she just thought she could do it? I know we're getting inside of her own brain, but you have a good insight.
I spoke to a lot of laboratory experts who explained to me that even though there's been the advent in the past 20 years of this field called microfluidics, which refers to the repurposing of the microfabrication techniques that were pioneered by the computer chip industry, and those techniques have been repurposed to move tiny fluids through tiny channels. Even with microfluidics, people have not been able to figure out how to run hundreds of tests, or even 50 tests, different tests on a tiny blood sample. And there are several reasons for that. And one of them is that there are several big classes of blood tests, about a half dozen of them. And usually when you've got your tiny sample and you use it to run several tests from one class of blood tests, such as, say, immunoassays, you have no blood left for the other classes of tests, which require completely different laboratory techniques and instruments. You just don't have enough sample left.
Which makes total sense.
The other problem is that capillary blood, which refers to the blood that comes from the tip of a finger, is polluted with tissue and cells, and is just not a pure draw, as pure a draw that you get from the vein. And one test in particular, no one has been able to solve this test and get it right for blood pricked from the finger. It's potassium. And sure enough, Theranos encountered problems with the potassium test. And my source, the former lab director, explained to me as early as our first phone call that Theranos would get potassium test results for patients that were so high that they only made sense if the patients had been dead, except the patients were alive.
And you talk about in the book, the Edison machines, they were not working. They were taking blood samples from potential investors and partners, running them into the back to put them on other machines, or just coming up with fabricated results.
Right.
This is sociopathic behavior.
It's even a little bit more complicated than that. So the Edison refers to the second generation of the technology, which was just an immunoassay machine. So it could only do one class of blood tests, and it didn't do them reliably. And the third generation of the technology was called the mini lab. And that was supposed to be a box that it was a bigger box, and it was supposed to do more than just one class of blood tests. When they went live with the blood tests in Walgreens stores in the fall of 2013, the mini lab was a prototype that didn't work at all.
Oh my God.
So what they did was they dusted off the Edison, and they used that for a few immunoassays, and then they hacked the Siemens machines to run all the other tests. And then to convince investors that they really did have groundbreaking new technology, they would stage these demos with not just investors, but board members, even media members, where they would have the mini lab prototype. They would prick the visiting VIP's finger. They would put the blood in a cartridge, slot the cartridge into the mini lab, turn it on, it'd start whirring. And then they would say, it's going to take a little while. Why don't you come and either visit the lab or have lunch or go
Don't look at what's over here.
Go meet with Elizabeth in her office. And so the VIP would leave the room, and then a Theranos employee would stop the machine, take the blood out, and bring it to the lab, and that little blood sample would either get tested at the bench by one of their laboratory technicians,